Japanese humans there, that they're all running around with them.
You're kidding? They were recycling, Hugh.
Right.
When it comes to bipedal primates, some might wonder why, if there is a creator, why would he make so many of these bipedal primates? And I don't know if that's something you want to speculate on, but I'll ask the question.
Well, it kind of leads into the next chapter where we talk about the great why questions. And the question is, why would God make all these bipedal primates? And that's kind of the evolutionary response. It must be evolution because we can't see a good reason for the creator making them. But we do point out a good reason in the book, namely that the continents that had bipedal primates that predated human beings, these are the continents that have suffered the least extinction of large-bodied birds and mammals. And keep in mind, from the creator's perspective, these are the species of life that are most valuable to human beings. And yet they're the species that we human beings, as a result of our sin, are most prone to drive to extinction. And therefore we can see the value of God creating a sequence, a chronological sequence of bipedal primates, where each succeeding species is a little more effective at hunting large-bodied bird and mammal species. And this would give those creatures an opportunity to adapt step by step to the coming shock of the super predator, namely we human beings.
In other words, if we had come without these generations of hominids before, we might have wiped out all the other mammals?
Well, for example, North and South America and Australia, we see no evidence that there were bipedal primate species that predated the entry of human beings. And in those continents, we witnessed between 75 and an 85% extinction rate for large-bodied bird and mammal species, whereas Africa, which had almost all the bipedal primate species represented, had an extinction rate of only 14%.
So God, from a creator's perspective, he gave them a fighting chance for the onset of humanity.
Well, he did, and he also made sure that Africa was a place where he created the most of these large-bodied bird and mammal species.
What this chapter is about, isn't it?
Well, I actually argue that we adults don't ask enough why questions.
Yes.
We need to take a cue from our children here. And the problem is that in science, there's this perception that scientists only deal with the what and the when and the where, and to some degree the how, and we leave the why to the philosophers and the theologians. And I'm arguing in this book that good theology also asks the question of how, when, and where. Good science also needs to ask the question of why. Asking why questions can often expose some of the weaknesses in your model and the strengths in your model. I mean, if you see an anomaly, something that doesn't fit with your model, you need to ask the question, why would, say, a creator or an evolutionary perspective predict this kind of anomaly be there?
Yeah.
And so that'll help you appreciate, again, just how comprehensive or weak or strong your model is.
Okay, having said that, let's get into some of these important why questions. One of them that comes up quite a bit because people like animals is, why would a good God create carnivores?
Well, that's often been posed by younger creationists. I mean, why would God make carnivores? Atheists tend to ask the question why God would make parasites. And both of these classes of life play a critical role in enhancing the quality of life for the herbivores. I mean, we all look at these rabbits and cows and goats and sheep as nice creatures, but the truth of the matter is they wouldn't do as well if there weren't carnivores and there weren't parasites. And so I give some examples in the chapter of exactly how carnivores and parasites benefit life. On the other hand, I'm also careful to point out that we human beings have made parasitic attack much more devastating than the Creator had intended. For example, when we human beings came upon the scene, mosquitoes were restricted to about 10% of the surface area of the planet. Now they're virtually 99% of the surface of the planet. There's very few places you can go where there aren't mosquitoes.
That's right. I know from going camping, you can't go without your mosquito spray.
Well, I mean, again, we have spread mosquitoes where God never intended. Likewise, we refer to houseflies.
Yeah.
We've been responsible for spreading them. Certain rodents we have spread to places where God never intended they would be. And so, we talk about these pests. But the truth of the matter is, it's our fault that these creatures are as pestilent as they appear to us.
In their intended locale, they serve a purpose.
They serve a purpose, a very
Okay.
good purpose.
So for carnivores, you mentioned what they do and parasites, but go ahead and elaborate a little bit.
Well, what I do in the book is I give examples where we introduce herbivores without the carnivores. A good example would be the rabbits that were brought into Australia. Now, they're carnivores in Australia, but they weren't adapted to feeding on the rabbits. So the rabbits multiplied under control, and they began to eat up the vegetation, and they got disease, and they started dying off in huge numbers. And it's a good example, if you don't maintain the health and the population of the carnivores, that affects the health, the longevity and the quality of life of the herbivores. And what you actually see are some herbivores that are very tolerant of carnivores in recognition from a divine perspective of the benefit that they bring. And I think the perspective here is we fail to appreciate, those of us that live in cities, is that the animal carnivores, for example, are very different than us in our carnivorous activity. When we hunt the very best. Animal carnivores can't afford to do that.
We go for the trophy, the ones with the biggest horns or what have you.
Right.
Yeah. Biggest
And
antlers.
God, that's something that you see in previous chapters of the book, that God designs in such a way that the ecology is always in perfect balance, where the herbivores and the carnivores don't have an advantage over one another. The carnivores are designed so that they can just barely kill some of the species of life and the individuals in the herbivore tribe. They basically have to content themselves with hunting the weak, the sick, the diseased, the dying, and the unaware. The healthy animals, they're not going to have any capability of being able to kill. Whereas when we humans go hunting, we ignore the sick and the dying and the weak, and we go after the best.
Yeah, we want to put something over our doorway, right, with the big antlers.
Or we want the best possible food in our table.
There you go, yeah.
Yeah, we're not going to tolerate eating something that's 30 years old, for
Yes,
example.
Yes. Well, I'll let the readers dig into that particular question a little bit more in that chapter. But how about junk DNA? That's often an argument brought on the table by those who disagree with our position here.
Especially theistic evolutionists, and for that matter, naturalistic evolutionists. They'll bring that charge up.
What is this type of DNA?
Well, the evolutionists will point out that the more advanced the species and the later the species come upon the terrestrial scene, the more DNA we see in their genome that does not serve the purpose of structuring the plan for the building of particular proteins. They call it non-protein coding DNA. And geneticists used to think that all of that non-protein coding DNA was simply accumulated junk from the evolutionary process. We human beings have the most junk. And they thought, well, it's because we're last upon the scene and we're the most complex, so we've accumulated the most junk from the evolutionary process. The problem was these geneticists were not looking for purposes other than coding for the construction of the protein molecules. And we now recognize is that there's many different purposes that the DNA serves. And so what I've done here is to give a quick list. There's a more detailed one in our book, Who is Adam?, where we point out that the more geneticists study the genomes of these advanced creatures, the more they're discovering purpose for what we used to call junk. So this label of junk is referring to a smaller and smaller piece of the genome, and we're now talking only a few percent or less where we can't identify specific